Okay. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, let's start.
Welcome to, shall we start now at 5? Hello, everybody.
Yep.
Welcome. Welcome to Alison Fine Arts Summer Series. This is actually our second talk in our series. The first one focused on Hong Kong, the history of Hong Kong art. And this second one, as you all know, is the title is Defining Hong Kong Art. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Daphne King, and I am the director of Alison Fine Arts. Alison Fine Arts was founded in 1981 in Hong Kong, and we are one of the oldest galleries around. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary next year. Our gallery focuses mostly on Chinese contemporary art, but in particular Hong Kong artists, diaspora artists, and mainland Chinese artists, with an emphasis on Chinese ink painting or ink art. Before we begin our talk, I would like to briefly share with you the exhibition that is going on now in our gallery called Uniquely Hong Kong, a celebration of Hong Kong art. And based on that, this is kind of what our discussion or how the summer talk series came about. So with that, I'd like to share our slides. Since unfortunately most of you cannot be here and it's a Zoom talk, I just wanted to very quickly go through the artists that are represented in this exhibition. There are 28 Hong Kong artists in total. And the artists are divided into 5 groupings. The first grouping, I have what we call the innovators, and those are artists that were who kind of came to Hong Kong at the turn of or after the war in the 1940s, late 40s, early 50s. And they include artists such as Liu Shuquan, who is kind of known as the founding father of the New Ink Art movement, Irene Cho, who is one of his students, and Feng Zhaoling, who is another very well-known internationally established artist. And then in the next room, what we have is East Meets West, and those are the artists that came maybe a decade after the first group of artists that I just spoke of. And what I call them East Meets West because a lot of these artists had the opportunity to travel overseas, were exposed to Eastern or Western art. So their art, they're trying to merge or marry the East with the West, be it in their medium or in their style of composition. So they include artists such as Cui Zihong, and then Feng Ming Chip, and Han Zifan, Pat Hui, Lucius Wong, and Nancy Wu. And the next section I have titled Nature and Environment. This corner of the gallery has artists who work obviously in nature and also in environment. They might have some commentary on current environmental issues. They include Hong Hoi, Gan Dai Keng, Cassia Ko, Gum Zi Keng, Lee, Eddie Liu, Winnie Mack, Mok Yasung, and Fiona Wong. And the next section is simply titled Hong Kong Scenes. And I think when you see the artwork, you'll understand why. They include Zhu Hinghua, Gong Kai Ming, T.C. Lai, Rosanna Lee, Man Feng Yi. And the last section I have titled Reinventing Tradition. And this is a selection of younger artists, emerging artists, who are still, well, I think they're reinventing the tradition because they're looking at it to create their own work, but they don't have this East Meets West component anymore because by now Hong Kong is FAR and not under British colony. So this younger group of artists includes Cherry Chuk, Hao Gunting, Hui Hoi Kiu, and Ling Pui Zi, and lastly, Zhang Xiaoli. So it's quite, as you can see, quite a large variety of different artists working in, in different medium. but they're all Hong Kong artists. So this talk will endeavor to define what makes an artist a Hong Kong artist. So before we begin, I'd like to thank all the panelists, and I'd like to introduce them. The first one, we have Elaine Ng. Elaine is the editor and publisher of Art Asia Pacific. It's a publication that's been around for 27 years, and it's dedicated to contemporary art from Asia, the Pacific, and the Middle East. She currently also sits on the advisory board of Asia Art Archives in Hong Kong and the New Hall Art Collection at Cambridge University. And she's also currently a lecturer on Asian modern and contemporary art, feminist art, and research methodologies for the arts at the Hong Kong Baptist University. The second speaker we have is William Lin. William is the founder and managing director of CL3 Architects Limited. He's also, in addition to an architect, also an avid art collector and an artist himself. He represented Hong Kong at the Venice Biennale's International Architecture Exhibition in 2006 and again in 2010. The third speaker we have is Carmen. Carmen Shek is she's the senior specialist and head of sales in Chinese paintings department at Christie's Hong Kong. She joined Christie's in 2009 and 2013, and she curated Beyond Tradition, Christie's first exhibition devoted to Chinese contemporary ink paintings, which later then traveled to New York and Hong Kong, traveled to New York. And last but not least, we have our moderator, Alexander Seno. She is head of development at Asia Art Archives. She's also an art critic. And she has also been, she was an advisor at Spring Workshop, and she was a former board member at Parasite. And she's also on the executive committee of the Oriental Ceramic Society. So with that, I would like to hand the mic or the platform over to Alex to begin our discussion. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's a great day to be thinking of Hong Kong because I feel like it's a sunny day. The world just got better today now that we can all have dinner until 9 p.m., but just 2 people. But I think it's a very, there's so much to talk about, and especially at a time like this. I'm just going to go through some housekeeping. If you have any questions, please send them through either the Facebook comment section or the Q&A box within Zoom. You can of course raise your hand or all that if you're more comfortable with that. We'll be talking with the panelists until about 5:30, 35:40. Then we'll open it up for questions. We really do welcome questions because there's really so much to explore about this idea of Hong Kong art, and I'm very grateful to Daphne for the opportunity to explore this topic. So what I'm going to do is first I want to ask everybody, starting with Elaine, about your own relationship with Hong Kong art. How did your relationship with Hong Kong art start?
Sure. So thanks, Daphne, for inviting me to be on this Zoom panel for your show, which I highly encourage everyone to go see. I mean, not only are there many of my own favorites like Chu Hinghua, Feng Ming Chip, Irene Chow, but there are also many artists that I just discovered back in June when I went to go see the show. So my relationship with Hong Kong art started, well, first when I went to my aunt's house and I saw this beautiful painting by Louis Chan, and I didn't know who it was, but I found it extremely poetic and something very unique to Hong Kong. It was about dragon boats. So I asked my aunt about it, and she said, it's this Hong Kong artist, Louis Chan. Then when I graduated university and I was looking for a job, I ended up working for Johnson, who was showing Louis Chan. So for me, that was really my first introduction to Hong Kong art.
And about what year was this? When was this?
This is in the when I first saw the work. I think she got that painting in the 80s, 1980s. So I was a young girl. But when I started to work for Johnson, that was in the mid 90s. I don't exactly remember, like, was I 8 or was I 10? But I remember it distinctly because it's not really, I think Louis Chan is pretty unique in terms of his style. Maybe not his subject matter, but his style is pretty unique. Anyway, through Johnson, that's when I really started to, when I started to work for Johnson, that's when I started to interact, let's say, with Hong Kong artists. People who Daphne also shows, who's, you know, her mother, big proponent of, people like Wushis Wong, also Irene Chow. But I remember distinctly this one show that was being prepared, I want to say at the year before the handover of Hong Kong. I'm trying to remember if he did it before or after. And I was meeting people like Ellen Pao.
Oh, wow.
And Hosu Gay. And for me to, you know, Gaylord Chen used to walk into the gallery, but to artists like Hosu Gay and Ellen, who are a little bit more closer to my age, and doing really, let's say, they weren't doing ink art, but they were doing multimedia stuff, video art, sculpture, conceptual kind of works. And they were really exploring this question about Hong Kong identity, especially around the return of Hong Kong back to China. And so for me, that was really fascinating, that conversation within those artists' works. But I would say that even the artists that are included in Daphne's show, they were also examining Hong Kong. Like I would say, for instance, you know, Louis Chan or Chu Hinghua, you know, they're really looking at the environment and reflecting on it, and you can see it in their works. And I think we have to remember that Hong Kong itself is a city founded by refugees. And so when you think about the refugee, you know, DNA or the refugee gene, there's always this question about who am I? And that's how, when I look at Hong Kong artists, I always feel like that is a really overarching question. Not necessarily like identity politics, but who am I with this ink tradition? And now I'm in this new world that is, you know, a British colony. How do I bridge this thing between East and West? I mean, identity, you know, comes in many different shapes and forms. So for me, when I look at Hong Kong artists, not necessarily if they were born, because for instance, Louis Chan was born in Panama. And even people like Feng Ming Chip, they meant like many other artists born in China and then came to Hong Kong, right? So for me, it's less a question about where they were born, but really, are they part of a dialogue that many artists are taking part here in Hong Kong, you know, participating in here in Hong Kong.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Elaine. William, what was your, you know, you're an architect, you're also an artist, but what was your kind of moment when you, and you're a collector as well. What was your aha moment in terms of contemporary art? Hong Kong.
Contemporary Hong Kong art. Well, maybe I go back to when I start to like know more about Hong Kong art. Actually, I started like actually a long time ago, and I like around 2000, the first kind of during SARS was well. I had a shop on Peel Street, and then guess who was our neighbor was John Batten, and he was showing a lot of Hong Kong artists at that time, but I totally didn't understand at all what he was doing. I remember he was doing like a whole room full of Tung Kin Wa's, you know, wallpaper, and I had no idea what he was doing at all. And so for many years, I didn't really pay much attention until like maybe 2006. That was when I was actually looking for Tao Fei's work, a mainland Chinese artist, and her, you know, she came up with this very amazing series, which kind of got all sold out, and then all of a sudden I found this information about Parasite, and they said they were doing an exhibition and they have this edition of Tao Fei's work. So I called up Parasite. I have no idea what Parasite was. And then I was talking to Tobias, and he was saying, like, just come in and have a look. We're having an opening tomorrow. And I went, and I think it was a Lee Kid show. And I totally, it's like, where is the artwork? It was just all kind of tables and tablecloth, and people were just hanging around. So it's like, it was a very kind of almost shocking introduction to this type of art form during that time when the mainland Chinese art scene was well developed, and you know, they were selling like work on canvas and for a lot of money. And then all of a sudden I saw these Hong Kong artists doing like things on tablecloth, and people were camping out and using it as picnic blanket and all that stuff. And they were saying, oh, if you don't, you know, after this work, you can just throw away the tablecloth. So it was a drastic difference, a drastic change. And I don't know, you know, for some reason, I always had a feeling for the underdog. And then so with that in mind, I started to look at Hong Kong artists' work. And then the next one would be, you know, it would be like, at that time, it was like Teng Kin Hua, who just did these kind of wallpaper. And then when you look closely, you're shocked with like the message that he's trying to convey. And then actually Lam Tong Pang at the time was probably more established. He was already working with a gallery. He was working with Grotto. But he was doing work on plywood and you know, basically very kind of, you know, raw work. And then there was Wilson, who was doing, you know, he was probably the first artist who actually can survive with a full-time career. So he was doing, you know, the very fine, you know, Chinese kind of painting type. So in a way, that was the art scene I was exposed to. I remember going to graduate shows, and so I started catching up with more Hong Kong artists, what they're doing, and I would go to a show, and I would, you know, the graduation show of I think it was Ho Xin Tong, who was doing these kind of, you know, meticulously time-consuming map. She was drawing like the Grand Theater at you know, at the Cultural Center, and she was drawing every seat with pens, you know, with pencil, and writing, you know, drawing every seat number and all that. So it was like very time-consuming work. Whereas in China, they were doing kind of work on canvas that probably some were starting to hire assistants to do their work. So it was such a drastic difference that made me kind of draw to the Hong Kong art scene. And also at the time, nobody was really collecting them, including museums. They were not really collecting these work. I remember Bak Xiangqun had an exhibition at the Hong Kong Museum of Art. And at the end of it, he actually gave me these big kind of dice made out of cloth, because he was going to throw them away. So I still have 2 of those dice, and because the museum didn't take them.
Yeah.
That was the art scene I kind of stumbled upon, you know, when I was starting to learn about Hong Kong art.
It's really amazing how quickly, you know, this idea of Hong Kong art has come to the fore. I have some follow-up questions for you, William, but before that, Carmen, tell us a little about your relationship with Hong Kong art. So you're with Christie, and but you do paint, ink painting more broadly. How does Hong Kong fit into all of this?
So my first exposure to Hong Kong ink art was a pair of Loy Sao Kwan landscape paintings that I got from an American collector in 2011. And that time, I think not that many people talk about contemporary ink as a concept. So it was an emerging thing. People were like, okay, these are Hong Kong artists, but we don't really know where to place them. So they're always sort of put towards the end of the sale. And then I thought they were just fascinating because they're so different from all the other landscape paintings that we sold normally that were painted by mainland Chinese artists around the same time frame. And then until 2013, I started getting to know many of the artists that we've seen in Daphne's show, including Wu Shizhuang and, for example, Leng Gerting. And they really gave me, and through many interesting conversations, they really give me the framework of what Hong Kong was about at that time. And of course, many of the stories are the stories of my parents and my grandparents, and they all feel really relevant to us here today. But I think for me, what is most interesting looking at the sort of first generation new ink artists is always, if we look at their counterparts in mainland China and what they were doing and what Hong Kong as a place has allowed them to create and do something that is so different. And that always fascinates me because I think both Elaine and William touch on the identity issue. And I think Hong Kong is that unique space where, everyone was managing to find a niche for themselves, and they're brave enough to have the artistic language coming out through their artwork. And William also touched on, when you talk about Wilson Sheh being a full-time artist, and then if we look back in the 60s and 70s, no one could afford to be a full-time artist at the time. And I think each of those artists bring their profession with them with their artwork too. So if you look at Loy Sao Kwan working for Yamate Ferry, and he was always fascinated with, the harbor and the water and the fishing boats and everything. And Wush is, he was trained in graphic design, and there's so much of that element, like Leng Gerting as well, brought to their work. So it's really actually the outcome of, in a way that, they're not full-time artists, but they all had their day jobs, and that actually added a lot to the diversity of Hong Kong ink art as well.
Yeah. Really, really, really good points. I'm going to step back a little, and I want to ask each person, who is a Hong Kong artist? Like, what would you personally consider to be a Hong Kong artist? William, you want to start?
It's hard because I have many favorites, and I think it depends on what period you're talking about. I would say, maybe let me say this first. I think, the reason why Hong Kong artists in a way is so interesting to me, I think it's almost a kind of lifestyle. It's not really about producing art for the market, because there was no market for the longest time. So actually, I think the reference you can draw is, in the literaries of in China before. They were like the Zhuk Lam Chet Yin and all these literaries. They were also not really professional artists. Again, I think in China, there was no market like that, but these people are scholars. These people are, like Fu Yi, the rich second generation, or whatever they are, but they were just producing art as a byproduct of their lifestyle. I think they would be, drinking or doing things or studying or whatever. And then all of a sudden they took out a brush and they started drawing. And those were the artwork they were creating. And I think in a way, to me, in the Hong Kong artists now, like just now, when Carmen was saying, a lot of them have full-time jobs. So actually they don't produce art to make a living. So like at one point in Fortan, a few artists will get together and rent a space, and they were just using it as a weekend getaway. And just at that time, then they would be producing artwork, and a lot of them were surprised that they could be sellable, including like I met Hao Fan at one time. and he was saying, "Oh, how can you be buying my photographs? I never thought that anyone would collect these kind of photography." So I think it's, in a way, it's very interesting because it is almost like a way of life. So coming back to who I think is the Hong Kong art, I think, to me, who I think is so important because he has influenced many generations, I think is Zhu Henghua. Just also, I didn't collect ink art for a long time, but now I do some. But I think in terms, when I look at his work, and then I look at some of the works of, some of the younger Hong Kong artists, I see a lot of influence that came from him. And I think the way he painted city, he painted people, and the kind of the psychological impact within his painting. I think he worked for a mental asylum before. So I think all this makes it so interesting. And to me, I think he is the personification of Hong Kong art.
Yeah. Okay. Elaine, in your many different lives, both as someone who has been such an advocate for contemporary art and as a publisher, how would you kind of define what Hong Kong art is?
So when we get together and have editorial meetings, I mean, we talk about, for instance, we can't have an entire issue with artists only from Japan, just for instance, right? We try to have a sense of diversity, which you can see throughout the entire region, right? As we know, Asia is not just China. So when we talk about Hong Kong artists, and strangely, because of COVID and our inability to travel, in many ways, the editors had to go out even more so and really focus our time here in Hong Kong, without, let's say, alienating, the other art scenes that we cover and readers from other parts of the world. But when we talk about Hong Kong artists, we talk about it more as a kind of place, excuse me, and not as a kind of, Hong Kong is not a nationality, but you know what I'm saying. We don't approach it in that way. So for instance, so Nadim Abbas is not ethnically Chinese, but for me, I mean, he's half Chinese and he's half Pakistani, right? But he's not 100% ethnically Chinese, but we would not even get into that discussion that he's not a Hong Kong Chinese, artist. Yeah. It's more like artists that are active in the city, that are making interesting, relevant work. That's how we decide who we want to cover. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So, point taken. And for Carmen,
we would cover someone like Map Office.
Sure.
They're French. They've been here since the 90s. We like them very much. We would write about them. And, the case in point is that, they were even chosen to be part of the Hong Kong Pavilion at Venice. So I think this thing about like what makes an artist part of a place is really that they're active in that place, right? So when Ho Han Ru curated the French Pavilion, and the majority of the artists, actually all the artists, were Chinese. I mean, I think that is actually that's the main point when you're looking at an artist.
Yeah, and I think at my day job at Asia Art Archive, one thing that we're always interested in is exhibition histories. Exhibition history. So, you to look at what people were looking at, to look at what was being presented at a certain moment in time. And if you look at something like the Hong Kong Art Museum when it first opened, a lot of those shows were quite mixed. So like the first show for Western medium art included Rosamund Brown, who whose art career was in Hong Kong, or even oh gosh, I'm forgetting now. You know, the kind of what was being exhibited as art of the time, I think was very different. And so, like with Carmen, so the last time Carmen and I were on a panel, it was for Irene Chow. And I was saying like how I had happened to be in Brisbane and I was going to the museum there, and I was walking around and looking at all this stuff, and I turned a corner and there was this huge Irene Chow in the Australian room. And I'd always thought of her as a Hong Kong artist, but obviously in Australia, she's thought of as an Australian artist because she spent the last years of her life there. How do you define what a Hong Kong artist is? I mean, Zhao Wuqi lived here for a few months, years, right? So what is a Hong Kong artist, Carmen?
I feel that it's really Hong Kong as a place that is the main driver of shaping who they are. So that could be their education, that could be their family background, that could be their workplace, right? So, but then for that element, or while during their duration in Hong Kong at some point, if they're not from Hong Kong, it has to be a critical phase where, they came up with that thinking behind their artwork. And I think that's really what tied them to the Hong Kong artist identity.
Yeah.
And it's more than someone just being born in Hong Kong and they could live in the US or they could work in somewhere else. And, and we live in a very sort of global world now, right? So people travel all the time, if not during COVID. And it's very hard to pinpoint where people are from and what identity they have. But I think, like some of the artists that we talked about, it's really, they really manifest Hong Kong as a main inspiration in their work. And I think if we take Hong Kong out of that equation, it would be something that's completely different. So I think that would be a key definition for me.
Sure. Actually, Daphne, I actually want to ask you a question. And what I really enjoyed about the show that you have at the gallery now is that it's also a story of relationships. So Alison was one of the first few kind of professional galleries to be in Hong Kong representing contemporary ink art, like this new ink. And I think that for me, I make the difference between what's art market and art world. And I think in terms of innovation, so many of the things that that Alice King was showing in the early days were so innovative, and it all happened in Hong Kong. So, what Liu Shou-Kwan did with ink painting, or, Liu Guosong, that sort of program. What was your mom thinking when she was starting to do all of this, really? Again, these works had no value. They were not no value, but they were, back then. And like, as William points out, we only really developed this sort of Hong Kong art market for Hong Kong art only in the last, 15 years? So it's very new. Like, what is your mom thinking?
I think that this is probably true for most gallery owners, that when you open a gallery, you're not really thinking about the market, and you're not really thinking about, I'm going to be making a lot of money. You're doing it because you're really passionate about the art, and you want to support the art scene and the artists, in the city that you live in, or be it overseas. So I think for her, the focus was Chinese contemporary art because she wanted to be able to support these Chinese artists. And when the gallery first started, I think in the 80s, you have to remember that China was still quite closed. And so the focus of the gallery was on Hong Kong artists, as well as the group of artists that we call a Chinese diaspora artists, such as like Zhao Wuqi, Chu Te-Chun, or Wallace Ting, who were from China, but then they left and settled overseas. So I think for her, it was just really kind of a project of passion that she was doing it. And it's only, even in Hong Kong, if you look at it historically, it's only in the last 2 decades maybe that this art industry has begun to flourish, and that there's so many galleries, there are a lot more collectors coming on board now. So even when I organized this particular exhibition, my thinking behind it was, we're in the midst of COVID, but we had kind of a dip, and things were opening up in Hong Kong. And I really wanted to support the arts community. With Art Basel canceled, there weren't opportunities. A lot of the artists had created artwork already, and they didn't have a chance to show it. And I think, I speak for probably all of us around here that, we really were starving to see some sort of art and to get out. So it was very opportunistic. When we opened the exhibition in mid-June, you know, Hong Kong was in a really good place, and I was completely overwhelmed with the response. We actually had over 100 people attend our opening that evening. So yeah, so I think a lot of it is just by passion. You're not really thinking about, I got to make money, I got to make money when it's at the market.
Add to that, you know, when people ask me, you know, oh, there's like, oh, we're interested in learning more about art. I'm like, well, go look for yourself, figure out what you like, because you have to live with the stuff. But I always say, look, if you're living in Hong Kong, look at Hong Kong artists, because they address our immediate needs. So like the work, for example, over your shoulder, I don't know, we can't really, but it's like the plates with the people with the masks. I thought that's so funny, and that's something we relate to. So it's something that both William and Elaine have touched on, this idea of like connecting with our own experience, our lived experience. So that's quite interesting. But I also say, you know, it's like Hong Kong artists are still so affordable, which is another reason I think to support the arts. And one thing is, yeah, well, yes, some artists, right? But I also think, you know, when you're buying, sure, some people can now work full time as an artist, but to buy a work of art is also supporting someone's practice and career. And I think that's so important in terms of the ecology that we're all part of, right? So that's the other kind of point. This is my last question for everyone, and I hope people start sending their questions in the Q&A box so we can open it up to everybody. To each person, what do you think is the most exciting thing going on in contemporary art from Hong Kong? So I'm going to switch it over. This time, Carmen, you go first. What is the most exciting thing?
For me, it's the younger artists. So I think for an ink, which I know better than other categories. So I think the market right now is pretty well aware of the sort of the first generation of ink artists, such as Lui Xiaoquan and Lucius Wong and Huang Zhaolin. And then I think we're really looking at artists that were born between the 70s and the 90s now. And I think some of them are doing really amazing work, and they work with, and compared to their teachers, they are supported by a much healthier commercial environment and institutional environment. So they're allowed to, or they have access to good museum exhibitions, good gallery exhibitions, and they have a much easier access to sort of like a global audience. So, you know, some of the younger artists such as, you know, Cherry and then Hong Fai and all these figures, I think their future is actually really, really bright, and they can go very far. And it's just very exciting to see that.
Yeah, I think the conceptual, I mean, I think the education and the Hong Kong artists tend to be quite solid. So they're quite well trained, they're quite worldly. They look at things. That's really good points. William.
I think it's also, just have one more remark. I think it's also interesting when we look at Hong Kong artists, how they don't have the same sort of historical baggage as what I would see in, for example, in mainland China, where a student would come out from an institution or an art academy, and then they have a really sort of strong model to follow, and they have to paint exactly like their teachers, and then, you know, so on and so forth. And I think Hong Kong artists, at least the ones that we meet in Hong Kong, they are actually much more open to create new things. I mean, many of them actually come from the same school, but I think they're not sort of strictly adhere to certain models and certain styles, which is really nice to see. So there is that diversity even within the same generation of artists.
Okay, William. What's the
most
exciting thing?
I think the most exciting thing is where the Hong Kong art is at the kind of rim of an explosion. If not for COVID, it probably would have been, it would have gone ballistic already. I think, you know, because M+ probably would have opened around this time, and then the new renovated Hong Kong Museum of Art, I think, is wonderful. And there is so much feature on Hong Kong artists at this point. And then I think internationally, there are so much going on, you know, with Hong Kong artists. I was talking to someone who is organizing, you know, a big show for Lam Tong Pang somewhere, and some of my work, you know, in my collection are constantly being loaned out to international museums for exhibition. So I think it's probably one of those times when everything came together, you know, for Hong Kong artists. And I think this is, you know, probably the most exciting thing that's happening. And I see it, you know, going forward, it's just the beginning. It will go a lot further from this point onwards.
Yeah, someone, for example, like Wong Ping, right?
Oh, fantastic. It's amazing, you know, how, and I think that's one of the excitement about Hong Kong, you know, like getting to know about Hong Kong artists. You know, 5 years ago, he was just starting out almost, and we kind of were at his first show, and look how fast he has grown. I think that's the excitement. You probably can't do that much with, you can't say that much with a lot of artists in a lot of different places, but this is what's exciting. Look at Wang Ping, look at Samson, look, you know, all these people that are developing amazingly internationally.
Yes, if you don't know Wong Ping's work so much, although he's not in the show, he is actually trained as a animation. So he used to do animation for TVB or ATV or one of the local shows. And then he started doing these video works, and he's had a solo show at the New Museum and the Guggenheim. I mean, at that level, right? So I think that's very exciting. And you know, his humor, his sensibility is very Hong Kong. Like a lot of it is about sex, and it's just
when
really...
I first saw his work, it's like, this is so weird and so kind of out of the
box. Look away.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's no mistake that he's gonna go far.
Yeah, so that's exciting too. Elaine, what? Tell us what.
I would agree with what Carmen Williams
is
said.
Exciting you about Hong Kong art at the moment.
Yeah. So I would agree with what Carmen and William says. I mean, I think that the opportunities that young artists have today are, I mean, artists like Wu Shis and Louis Chan, Chu Hinghua, Gaylord, they would beg for the opportunities that artists in their 20s, 30s, 40s have today, right? I mean, even Leung Chi-wo, Warren Leung, and Sarah would say like, oh my God, all the places to that, you know, you could potentially show art, go look at art, the different university programs. You definitely have choice now. But I would say the most exciting thing, I am curious to see how the past, you know, year between the social unrest and also COVID, how that really seeps into artists' work. And to me, I think this is a period where we're going to see a lot of really different, interesting ideas, and possibly even breaking with, you know, certain traditions in terms of imagery, subject matter, materials, ways of working, right? So that's what I'm really excited to see.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. I'm going to start with some questions. We have quite a lot of questions. I'm going to start with one question from Malcolm O'Neill. To the panel, what is the biggest challenge the 1970s, 90s generation of Hong Kong artists face in the next 5 to 10 years? So what's the biggest challenge for artists?
Can I answer that?
Yes, please.
I would say the biggest challenge is to resist commerciality, because I think you will have a lot of opportunity to get tempted by, you know, by all this, you know, opportunity to sell art. So, I mean, even now, I think in this kind of past 5 years, you see a lot more artists working on canvas that never used to be so many. So I think you have to stay true to art and stay true to what, you know, is kind of academic about art. It's about the longevity of what you do and not really, you know, trying to make money from art, because I think now they have the opportunity to do that.
Yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with it. I'm all for artists making work, but I know what you mean by like doing the same thing, for example, because that's what the market expects. Really good point. So anyone else want to add to that? Although we have quite a few questions. Anyone else, Elaine or Carmen? Biggest challenge?
I think what William said is very true, because as an artist, you're always faced with the difficulty of going to the next level. Like everyone, you know, that we know already do what they do well very much. And then what do they do in the next level to do something that is new enough for them to sort of progress significantly? I think it's actually something that many artists couldn't go past that stage. So it's really something that they have to be very true to themselves and sort of reject all the distractions and work on it. So that's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, it's also universal, right?
Mm.
You stay fresh. Elaine?
I think the biggest challenge would be one where, you know, not just the market, but because the artists are so inundated with social media. So if you're looking constantly at all these images on Instagram, for instance, you know, of course you want to be curious about what people are doing, but to what degree does that infiltrate your own practice and how you make things? I think the other big challenge for a Hong Kong artist is like, you know, what stage do they want to be on, right? There are groups of artists that just want to be local and have their work relate to local audiences. And I think that's a choice that every artist has to make. And I think that's a really tough choice. And you can see it in many aspects, not just in art making. You can see it in economics, you can see it obviously in politics and, you know, various choices that you make. And I think artists are also making those kind of choices. Like, do I even care about being potentially shown at Art Basel in the encounter section? Or, you know, that's not for me. I just want to show to my peers and the people that I interact with, right?
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, I'm just going to jump in here. Probably one of the biggest challenge really is how to keep your art, how to keep your art going. It is such a challenge. You know, it is so difficult to be an artist, especially at a time like this. I'm always
consistent, Alex, in Hong Kong. This is not unique to 2020 for artists. I mean, if you look at what Carmen was saying, and there used to be, when I used to talk about Hong Kong artists, you know, I don't know, 10 years ago, I used to say the main criteria is that they all have day jobs, right? But now with Lee Kit and people like, well,
Wilson.
I don't know what Wilson Shea, but I don't know to what degree he's selling in the same way anymore. I would say Lee Kit is like the superstar, right? Yeah. It's a real, as William said, it's a real possibility. I mean, it's not even a possibility. People are doing it, right?
Yeah.
But I would say that it's not about just keeping it going, because Hong Kong artists have always found ways to make and, you know, work for Hong Kong Telecom, for instance.
Yeah, but I think I just think it's not really something that's that challenging. I think for the younger generation, because we were talking about how the older generation had to have a day job. When I was speaking to a lot of the younger emerging artists, I think that that's not so much an issue with them, because they were saying that the government actually does have funding for them. And if it's not the government, there's nonprofit organizations, like they can get grants to go overseas, and there's a lot more opportunity. Like one of the young artists, Cici Ling, that we were showcasing here, she was telling us in the last talk that we had how she, you know, was constantly traveling overseas on these grants from various organizations. So I think for them, it's not, you know, that challenge of where they have to find their money to make a living is gone, and they can really focus much more on their art. But I agree with everybody else that the challenge then becomes, how do we become not so commercial and stay true to ourselves? Because you do see certain artists who, you know, perform really well in auction, and they want to make sure that they're in auction and that they perform well, because that's, you know, they think that's important. But then there's other artists who just, you know, they remain true to what they want to do, and they don't really care about what the market is, you know, what's going on in the market. So I think it's quite difficult.
Sometimes it might not be within the artist's control. I mean, look at Christie and look at Ferencz Lai. I mean, you know, I don't know if the auction house is to be thanked or to be blamed. I mean, but they did so well in the last auction. Now, if I were them, what am I gonna do with you know, how do I stay true to my work when I knowing you know, Ferencz, I think she is very kind of honest with what she does. So but then when your work has just sold for $2 million, then how do you balance, you know, yourself? I think that's a good question.
Yeah.
But
Also,
one thing that at the recent graduation show at Baptist at AVA, there was almost no painting. There was very little. I remember there was one year there was like 90% ink painting or 90%, you know, works on canvas. This year it was like 10%. It was all sculptural installation works. So I also think that's an interesting new development for Hong Kong. I mean, artists in Hong Kong making sculpture. That's true.
For me, one of the most exciting young artists is Lily Chan, who's just won the BMW Art Prize. You know, female, but makes really strong sculpture.
Yeah,
Of course, she was trained abroad. She went to RISD and then Art Institute of Chicago. But there's that. But I also think that artists are just super resourceful here. So another artist whose practice I'm really interested in following is Elaine Ng, whose work I first saw at the art school graduation. So he does block painting, but he has a day job. So he's a tattoo artist.
I think he is fantastic.
Really strong composition, very solid. And he works very hard. But for him, it's like, well, he's had some shows, but he hasn't given up the tattoo thing because for him, that buys his freedom, right? And that's really super.
Actually, when I first saw his work, it reminded me when I first saw Wang Bing's work. I think it has that quirkiness and the lifestyle of the artist seems to have such an interesting story behind them.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, I'm just gonna run through, we have like a few more minutes. So some questions, I'm just gonna read them out and maybe just jump in if there's anything you wanna address. We have 8 questions, so I'm just gonna run through like 2 or 3 at a time. One really good question is from Cherry Chan. In visual arts, how do you think visual artists' interaction with other disciplines like design or film? Like Yang Wang, for example, works in film as well. How can this kind of interaction be showcased better, or is it just completely separate? It's one question.
Maybe the various institutions and organizations should maybe take a little bit more risks. I totally agree with Cherry that there are artists that are interdisciplinary, but you know what we tend to see time and time again in so many of, let's say, commercial galleries, if we're just talking about commercial galleries, is that it tends to be heavily on painting, right? And we understand why. So if there could be that place besides, let's say, Parasite or Osage, which just had an amazing show of Jeffrey Shaw, who is truly a treasure to be had here in Hong Kong, like one of the true pioneers of media art in the world, that he was here. I mean, it's very hard to see these kind of shows, right?
Yeah.
So if there could be more spaces or a willingness to also not just show painting, that would be a start.
Or more collaborations between different galleries, or I don't know, maybe it's a way to be able to see more things across different categories.
So I thought one of the best things in the last few months was the On Hollywood exhibition.
Oh yeah, that was so great.
Isn't that great? So this was when Hilda, who has a day job at Exit, decided to curate a show of contemporary artists doing interventions in the antique stores on Hollywood Road. I thought that was so much fun. I mean, you can it took the whole question of design versus art in somewhere else, and there's that. I think related to that, there's a question from Danielle. How should the art community support Hong Kong artists under the current circumstances?
Well, I think I'll just speak first because I think like doing exhibitions like what we have currently going on is a good way to support the Hong Kong community. And of course, holding talks like this so that we can talk more and there's more discussion about Hong Kong art and the art ecology and what's going on is, you know, is a good start.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, supporting institutions. So William and I used to be board members at Parasite. And, you know, I think it's important that we are part of this art community. And I think the beauty of Hong Kong is it's small enough. So, you know, it's not difficult to be involved. You know, there's AAA, just to plug my day job. I don't know, any other. Sorry?
What's your night job? I mean, you kept saying your day job. So
what's my night job?
Well, one of my favorite things about working with contemporary artists is also that we get to hear them speak about their work. So I think that's also a great platform, you know, on Zoom or any other platform that they can talk about their works and their history. And I think that's the best way for people to understand Hong Kong art scene and the individual artists as well.
Yeah.
Well, if you haven't seen the show at Osage now, I hope it's still going on. It's for, basically she hosted the graduation show that was normally at Chinese University. I think it's for the master degree. So I think in a way giving them a location that's in town, and the space itself is very generous. So the artists showed really nicely the work. So I think something like that is a fantastic opportunity to support Hong Kong artists.
Another way that's good to support Hong Kong artists is for, you know, like as an architect, if you're developing a building that there's a lot of public outdoor space, if we could showcase more of the Hong Kong artists, you know, source locally rather than go overseas to try to get the big names to do these installation pieces, or even, you know, in restaurants or hotels, that if we cautiously try to support and showcase what we have locally rather than, you know, going overseas. I think that's also another way to support the Hong Kong art scene.
Yeah, there's a mix, like, but I think it's also a mix, like to have.
Yeah, you have some, but you don't say, oh, I'm just going to choose you because you're a Hong Kong artist, but it's a selection, but make them part of that kind of, you know, that dichotomy.
Yeah, but I think
you could also, for instance, I mean, in addition to going to hear artists talk and understand their work and seeing these shows, I think we all agree that with the exception of someone like Lee Kit, we could probably all afford one piece a year by a Hong Kong artist. So I think one way that we could support Hong Kong art is to actually go to the galleries. And if the artists don't have shows, you could go to Photon, for instance, find out where the artist studios are and just buy that one work a year. And then slowly over time, you will slowly amass a collection like William Lim's and be very and you'll feel good about yourself. You're supporting the community. You're getting some great art, and it's not, you know, breaking.
I love also that people, you know, that people do what they can, and it's really a community here. People help each other. So during Art Basel, for example, I love that William opens his office, which is right across the Art Basel venue, and he does a little show of usually Hong Kong artists, right? So if you're going to see the Goethe Institute and you're there anyway, you pop up. And so I think this being able to offer other platforms, I think is very important too. Okay, we have 2 minutes more to go, so I'm afraid we will not be able, I think most of the questions have been answered in one way or another. At this point, I feel, I also want to thank the people who made this event possible. So Shannon and Pansy from Alisan, and Crystal and Ruby from AAA for the support. It's been so great talking to everyone, more than 2 people at a table. It's been fun, a topic we all love. So thank you everyone for joining us. And Daphne will do some closing.
Yes,
words.
I just
Closing words of wisdom.
Everybody, and I'm sorry, I guess a little bit of housekeeping. I'm sorry for the people who we didn't get to answer your questions. We will type an answer and send it to you separately. And for other participants, if you do have any other questions, you can also send us send us an email, and we'd be happy to continue our conversation. And with that, I would like to thank all of our participants and all of our panelists for taking the time out today to join us in this talk, What Defines Hong Kong Art? And just a plug for the exhibition, we have extended it. It was supposed to end on September 3rd, but because we have been receiving such wonderful response, we're going to extend the exhibition until September 26th. So if you haven't seen it yet, please come by the gallery to see all this lovely artwork, and you can decide for yourself what defines Hong Kong art. And lastly, this is part of a series, and we will be holding another talk shortly. We're still trying to figure out the perfect date, but it's going to be on Hong Kong woman artist. So that should be an interesting talk. It probably actually, unfortunately, is going to be in Cantonese, but we'll hopefully people will be able to participate, and we'll do a wrap up afterwards with, English summary if you don't understand it. But yeah, with that, I think I'd like to say goodbye, and I don't know if any of the other panelist speakers would like to say anything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, for moderating.
My
And
pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Carmen for participating, and to all our listeners. Hope to see you all soon.
Bye.
Bye.